Standing at the pulpit, I smoothed my collar and gazed at the familiar faces. My fingers trembled slightly as I gripped the worn leather Bible. The morning sunlight filtered through stained glass, casting rainbow shadows across my congregation. I was their shepherd, their guide, their pastor Rose Bennett, and I was living a lie. "Let us bow our heads in prayer," I said, my voice steady despite the storm in my heart. The pews creaked as 200 faithful souls lowered their heads. My own prayers lately felt hollow, echoing in the emptiness of my private quarters. Sarah, my best friend and choir director, caught my eye from the first row. She'd been asking why I seemed distant these past months. How could I explain the growing void? The questions that kept me awake at night? After service, James Johnson cornered me in the vestibule. "Pastor Bennett, the board meeting on Tuesday, we need to discuss your situation." His emphasis on that last word made my stomach clench. I knew what was coming. Another conversation about setting an example, about finding a suitable partner. I escaped as soon as I could, driving my old Volvo up to Lookout Mountain. The sun was setting, painting Chattanooga in shades of amber and rose. Tonight's meteor shower had drawn others to the lookout point, but I found a quiet spot away from the crowds. The first streak of light split the darkening sky. I closed my eyes, remembering Mama's words about shooting stars carrying wishes to heaven. What would she think of her daughter now? A pastor questioning everything she'd been taught to believe. "Mind if I join you?" A husky voice startled me from my thoughts. I opened my eyes to find a woman settling onto the grass nearby. Her black hair caught the last rays of sunset, and a guitar case rested at her feet. She had an untamed energy about her, like a wild song barely contained. "I'm Cameron," she said, pulling out a weathered notebook. "Just looking for some inspiration." Her green eyes met mine, and something shifted in the universe. Sometimes the stars write better lyrics than I do. We sat in comfortable silence as darkness fell completely. More meteors painted silver trails across the sky, and I found myself stealing glances at her profile. She scribbled in her notebook, occasionally humming fragments of melodies. "Beautiful, isn't it?" she murmured, not looking up. All those lights falling through the darkness. Her words carried a weight that resonated with something deep inside me. "Yes," I whispered. But I wasn't looking at the sky anymore. When she turned to face me, the air between us crackled with possibility. A shooting star streaked overhead, brighter than the others. "Make a wish, Pastor," she said softly. My heart stopped. "The caller gives it away," she added with a gentle smile. "Don't worry, your secret's safe with me." I should have been concerned that she knew. Should have maintained professional distance. Instead, I found myself asking, "What are you wishing for?" Cameron's smile turned mysterious. "Something real," she said. "Something true." She stood, gathering her things. "I play at the Foundry on Thursday nights. If you're ever looking for a different kind of sanctuary." She walked away, leaving me with a racing heart and a head full of questions. Above me, the stars continued their ancient dance, but something had shifted in my carefully ordered world. That night, for the first time in years, I dreamed in color and woke up humming a tune I'd never heard before. 3 days after the meteor shower, I found myself pushing open the door of Revelator Coffee. The morning crowd had thinned, leaving behind the scent of espresso and lingering conversations. I needed caffeine and clarity, not necessarily in that order. Well, if it isn't the stargazing pastor. That voice. I turned to find Cameron lounging in a corner armchair, her guitar case propped against the wall. She wore ripped jeans and a vintage band t-shirt, looking deliciously out of place among the business casual crowd. "Cameron." Her name felt dangerous on my tongue. "I didn't expect to see you here." A lie. I'd chosen this coffee shop precisely because it was far from my church, where I might run into someone like her. She gestured to the empty chair across from her. "Universe works in mysterious ways, doesn't it?" The gleam in her green eyes suggested she didn't believe in coincidences any more than I did. I sat down, clutching my latte like a shield. "Do you always write music in coffee shops?" "Only when I'm hoping to run into intriguing members of the clergy." She winked, and I felt heat rise to my cheeks. "Did you look up the Foundry?" Before I could answer, my phone buzzed. James Johnson's name flashed on the screen. I declined the call, but Cameron had already noticed my expression change. "Trouble in paradise?" she asked, closing her notebook. "Church politics." I sighed. "The board is concerned about certain aspects of my personal life." "Ah, the eternal question, who does the shepherd turn to for guidance?" Cameron leaned forward, her voice dropping. Maybe you need less guidance and more freedom. The way she said freedom made my pulse quicken. It's not that simple. It never is. She pulled out her phone, scrolling through something. Here, listen to this. She offered me one earbud. The music that filled my ear was nothing like the heavy rock I'd expected. It was haunting, melodic, with lyrics that spoke of breaking free from golden cages. Cameron's voice, raw and honest, wrapped around my soul. This is beautiful, I whispered, handing back the earbud. That's what I do, Rose. I tell truth through music. She said my name like a prayer, something sacred and secret. The moment was shattered by another call from James. This time, I answered. Yes, I'll be at the board meeting. Yes, I understand the concerns. When I hung up, Cameron was watching me intently. They're pushing for you to settle down, aren't they? Find a nice man. Set an example? I nodded, unable to speak around the lump in my throat. Come to my show tonight, she said suddenly. See what it's like on the other side of propriety. I can't. But even as I said it, I knew I would. 8:00. Back room of the Foundry. She stood, gathering her things. Wear something that isn't black. That evening, I stared at my closet, finally selecting a blue dress I hadn't worn in years. The board meeting had been tense, full of pointed questions about my commitment to traditional values. James had even suggested several eligible bachelors from neighboring congregations. As I drove to the Foundry, their voices echoed in my head, but when I slipped into the dimly lit back room, everything else fell away. Cameron was on stage, bathed in purple light, her soul laid bare through her music. When her eyes found mine in the crowd, she smiled, and I felt something inside me break free. Later, as I drove home, her melodies still echoing in my ears, I realized I was humming her songs. The woman who'd wished upon a shooting star had awakened something in me, something that couldn't be contained by stained glass and scripture alone. That night, I dreamed of green eyes and forbidden melodies, of breaking free and finding truth. When I woke, my pillowcase was damp with tears I didn't remember crying, and my heart was full of songs I didn't dare to sing. The Foundry became my secret rebellion. Every Thursday night, I'd slip away from my pastoral duties, trading my collar for civilian clothes. Cameron's band, Sacred Sinners, played to packed houses now. I told myself I was just supporting local music, but my racing heart knew better. Tonight, I stood in the shadows near the back, watching Cameron command the stage. Her voice soared through a new song, something about stars falling and hearts rising. When she sang the bridge, "Heaven's not a place, it's a feeling," her eyes found mine in the crowd. Sarah appeared beside me, making me jump. "So this is where you've been disappearing to." Her tone was gentle but knowing. I'd been so careful, but of course my closest friend would notice. "Sarah, I can explain," I started, but she squeezed my arm. "You don't have to." She nodded toward the stage. "She's talented, and the way she looks at you." The music swelled around us, Cameron's voice raw with emotion. I couldn't deny it anymore, not to Sarah, not to myself. The board would never understand. "The board isn't living your life, Rose." Sarah watched Cameron finish the song. "And from what I've seen, you haven't been living it either. Until now." The set ended and the crowd began to thin. Sarah hugged me quickly. "Your secret's safe with me. Just be careful." I made my way to the back door, where Cameron usually took her smoke breaks. The night air was heavy with approaching rain, matching the tension in my chest. She was there, leaning against the brick wall. "I was hoping you'd come tonight." Her guitar case rested beside her, covered in stickers and scrawled lyrics. "New song. What did you think?" "It was beautiful." I moved closer, drawn by some force I couldn't resist. The lyrics were about you. Thunder rumbled in the distance. "Everything I write lately is about you, Rose." The first drops of rain began to fall. Cameron stepped toward me, and the world narrowed to just us, just this moment. "I can't stop thinking about you," she whispered. "This could ruin everything," I breathed, even as I moved closer. "Or it could save everything." Her hand found my cheek, thumb tracing my jawline. The rain was falling harder now, but neither of us moved to seek shelter. When our lips met, it was like every sermon I'd ever preached about divine revelation. Soft at first, then deeper, more urgent. Her hands tangled in my hair as mine gripped her waist. The rain soaked through our clothes, but we were burning. A car door slammed in the parking lot, breaking the spell. We jumped apart, breathing hard. Reality crashed back. I was still Pastor Bennett, and tomorrow I had a meeting with James about potential suitors. Rose, Cameron started, reaching for me. I have to go. I backed away, touching my lips where I could still feel her kiss. Don't run from this, she called after me. Don't run from yourself. I drove home in a daze, rain pounding against my windshield. In my head, James's voice competed with the memory of Cameron's kiss. A pastor sets an example, he'd said just yesterday. The congregation looks to you for guidance on proper living. But what about proper loving? The next morning, I stood before my congregation, my lips still tingling with the memory of last night. I spoke about Daniel in the lion's den, about staying true to one's faith despite pressure to conform. As I preached, I saw Sarah in the front row, offering a supportive smile. After service, James cornered me again. I've arranged dinner with Richard Thompson next week. Fine man, runs the Baptist church in Cleveland. His tone left no room for discussion. I nodded automatically, but my mind was already drifting to Thursday night, to rain-soaked kisses and truth set to music. I touched my cross necklace, a gesture that used to bring comfort. Now it felt like both anchor and chain. That night, I dreamed of standing in the rain with Cameron, but this time we were on the church steps. In the dream, the congregation watched as we kissed, and instead of condemnation, they smiled. I woke up crying, knowing dreams and reality rarely align so perfectly. But for the first time in my life, I was ready to fight for something more than others' expectations. The question was, how much was I willing to lose to be found? Late-night songwriting sessions became our sanctuary. Cameron's apartment, a cozy loft above an old record store, felt worlds away from my carefully ordered life. Tonight, she sat cross-legged on her worn leather couch, guitar in lap, while I curled up beside her with a notebook. "What rhymes with salvation?" she asked, strumming softly. "Damnation," I replied without thinking, making her laugh. "Pastor's got jokes." She nudged me with her knee. "But seriously, help me with this bridge." I watched her fingers dance across the strings, mesmerized by how the calluses on her fingertips told stories of dedication. She'd been teaching me basic chords, our hands touching more than necessary during lessons. "Your turn," she said, offering me the guitar. As I positioned my fingers for a G chord, she moved behind me, arms wrapping around to adjust my grip. Her breath tickled my neck, and suddenly the music felt secondary. I turned my head slightly, meeting her gaze. The guitar slipped forgotten to the side as she leaned in, capturing my lips in a kiss that tasted of coffee and possibilities. My hands found their way into her hair as she pulled me closer. A sharp knock at the door startled us apart. Cameron cursed softly, checking her phone. "Damn, that's David, band meeting." I forgot. David, her drummer, had been giving us knowing looks lately during rehearsals. The whole band probably suspected, but they kept our secret. Unlike my world, theirs embraced the unorthodox. I gathered my things quickly, slipping out the back stairs as David entered through the front. These hidden moments were becoming harder to bear, but the alternative seemed impossible. The next morning, James called an emergency board meeting. I sat in the church office, surrounded by stern faces and disapproving murmurs. "Pastor Bennett," James began, "we're concerned about the example you're setting. A spiritual leader should be settled, married. The congregation needs stability." Elder Mary nodded. "We've noticed you've been distracted lately, and there are rumors about your evening activities." My heart stopped. "Rumors? About your involvement with local musicians?" James's tone dripped with disapproval. "It's unseemly for a pastor to frequent such establishments." Relief flooded me. They didn't know the whole truth. But James wasn't finished. "We've decided to accelerate our timeline. Either you find a suitable husband by the end of the month, or we'll need to reconsider your position here." The ultimatum hung heavy in the air. I thought of Cameron, of music and midnight kisses, of truth and consequences. "I need time to—" I started. "Time isn't a luxury we can afford," James interrupted. "The Davidson Memorial Fund is considering a substantial donation, but they're traditional folks. They need to see proper leadership." That evening, I drove straight to the Foundry. Cameron was rehearsing with the band but stopped mid-song when she saw my face. "5-minute break," she announced, leading me to the back office. "They're forcing my hand." I whispered, collapsing into her arms. Marriage or ministry? Those are my options. She held me tight, humming softly, the melody we'd been working on earlier. Or we could find another way. What other way? I pulled back to look at her. I can't lose my congregation, their family. Family shouldn't make you choose between love and acceptance. Her fingers traced my cheek. But I have an idea. It's crazy, but it might work. Before she could elaborate, David knocked on the door. Cam, we need to finish this set. She kissed me quickly. Come over later, trust me, Rose, we'll figure this out. I watched her return to the stage, my heart torn between two worlds. The cross around my neck felt heavier than ever, but when Cameron started singing, a song I recognized as ours, I remembered why we were fighting so hard. That night, as I lay in bed, my phone lit up with a text from her. Meet me tomorrow. Bring your faith in something bigger than rules. I touched my lips, still feeling her kiss, and made a decision. Whatever her plan was, whatever came next, I was done hiding. The board wanted me to set an example. Perhaps it was time to show them what true faith looked like. Marry me, David said, and I nearly choked on my coffee. We sat in Cameron's apartment, the morning sun painting shadows across her exposed brick walls. Cameron squeezed my hand. It's perfect, Rose. David's willing to help. A marriage in name only. I looked between them, Cameron's hopeful expression and David's easy smile. The plan was elegant in its simplicity, devastating in its deception. The board would have their married pastor, David continued. And you two could continue, whatever this is. He gestured vaguely between Cameron and me. It's crazy, I whispered. But the idea had taken root. Crazier than denying who you are? Cameron's voice was soft. Crazier than letting them force you into a real marriage? She had a point. Still, the weight of another lie pressed heavy on my conscience. I need time to think. That weekend, Cameron surprised me with a getaway to the Smoky Mountains. We drove her beat-up Jeep into the hills, leaving cell service and expectations behind. The small cabin she'd rented was rustic but private, surrounded by towering pines. No church board here, she said, unloading our bags. No pressure, just us. That evening, we sat on the cabin's porch, sharing a bottle of wine. The mountain air was crisp with approaching autumn, and Cameron had wrapped us both in a thick blanket. Tell me what you're thinking, she murmured, playing with my fingers. I'm thinking about truth, I said. About what's real and what's pretend. This is real. She lifted our entwined hands. What I feel for you is real. The stars emerged above us, reminding me of that first night on Lookout Mountain. If I agree to this plan with David, then we get time, she finished. Time to figure out how to live our truth without destroying everything you've built. Later that night, as we lay together in the cabin's small bedroom, the moonlight spilling across the sheets, Cameron traced patterns on my skin. Our clothes lay scattered on the floor, barriers finally broken. In the darkness, I found a different kind of worship. Morning found us tangled in sheets and possibilities. Cameron made coffee while I stood on the porch, watching the sun rise over the mountains. My phone had several missed calls from James, but for once, I didn't feel guilty ignoring them. I'll do it, I said when Cameron brought me coffee. The plan with David, but we need rules, boundaries. She set down her mug and pulled me close. Whatever you need, we'll figure it out together. The drive back to Chattanooga was quiet, both of us lost in thought. The reality of what we were planning settled over us like an approaching storm. A fake engagement, a sham marriage, all to protect something real and precious. Monday morning, I sat in my office staring at the phone. Finally, I dialed James's number. I've been seeing someone, I said before he could speak. We've been keeping it quiet, but it's serious. The silence on the other end was deafening. His name is David Parker. He's a musician, but also runs sound engineering for several churches. The lies felt bitter on my tongue, but I pushed through. We're discussing marriage. James's relief was palpable. This is wonderful news, Rose. The board will be thrilled. When can we meet him? As I arranged a dinner meeting, I caught my reflection in the window. The woman looking back at me seemed both stronger and more fragile than before. That evening, Cameron held me as I cried, whispering promises into my hair. It's temporary, she said, just until we find another way. But we both knew temporary solutions had a way of becoming permanent prisons. The question was, Could we find freedom within the walls we were building? I touched the cross around my neck, remembering my ordination vows. Lead me not into temptation, I whispered, but my heart finished differently. Lead me into truth. The Chattanooga Times Free Press announcement felt like a knife to the heart. Local pastor to wed music producer. The photo showed David and me at a church fundraiser, his arm around my shoulders, both of us smiling convincingly. Cameron had taken the picture herself, a detail that made everything more surreal. "You look happy," Sarah said, dropping the newspaper on my desk. Her tone carried no judgment, just concern. "It's complicated," I replied, the words tasting stale. "Isn't it always?" She closed my office door. "Rose, I saw you with her last week, at the coffee shop." My hands trembled as I straightened papers on my desk. "Sarah, you were looking at her the way you've never looked at David." She sat down across from me. "What are you doing?" Before I could respond, my phone buzzed with a text from Cameron. "Miss you, studio tonight?" These stolen moments had become our lifeline. While David and I played the happy couple in public, Cameron and I built our real life in the shadows. The guilt was consuming, but not as much as the fear of losing her. The wedding plans moved forward like a runaway train. James and the board insisted on a grand church ceremony, complete with local press coverage. A celebration of traditional values, they called it. That evening, I slipped away to Cameron's studio. She was recording a new album, something darker than her usual style. The song she played me that night broke my heart. "It's about loving in secret," she explained, setting down her guitar. "About watching someone you love pretend to love someone else." I reached for her, but she pulled away. "Cam, I saw the wedding dress delivery today." Her voice cracked. "White lace and promises, right?" "It's not real," I insisted, moving closer. "You know that." "Feels pretty damn real from where I'm standing." She ran her fingers through her hair. "Every time I see you with him." I silenced her with a kiss, desperate to prove what was real and what wasn't. She responded with equal fervor, backing me against the studio wall. Our touches were urgent, almost angry, filled with all the words we couldn't say. The next day, David called an emergency meeting. We met at a diner outside town, away from curious eyes. "The record label's interested," he said, sliding a contract across the table. "National tour, starting next month?" My heart stopped. "But the wedding?" "That's just it." He glanced at Cameron, who sat unnaturally still. "They want the whole band, 6 months on the road." The implications hung heavy in the air. Cameron would be gone for half a year, while I played happy newlywed for my congregation. "Maybe it's for the best," Cameron said quietly. "Give you time to figure out what you really want." "I know what I want," I snapped, then lowered my voice as heads turned. "Who I want." David cleared his throat. "The label needs an answer by Friday." I drove home in a daze, past the church where I was supposed to marry David, past the coffee shop where Cameron and I first connected. Everything felt wrong, like a sermon without scripture, a song without melody. At home, I found another wedding gift on my porch, a Bible from the church board, inscribed with promises of guidance and wisdom. Inside, they'd highlighted passages about marriage and duty. My phone lit up with a text from Cameron. "Come over, please." I shouldn't have gone. I had a wedding dress fitting in the morning, a marriage counseling session with the associate pastor in the afternoon. But I went, anyway. She opened the door in her songwriting clothes, worn jeans and my borrowed sweater. "I can turn down the tour," she said before I could speak. "No." The word hurt, but I meant it. "You can't put your life on hold for." "For what?" she challenged. "For us? For love?" "For a lie," I whispered. "This whole situation." She kissed me then, soft and sad, tasting of coffee and goodbye. We didn't talk much after that, letting our bodies say what our words couldn't. Later, watching her sleep, I thought about the wedding march I'd be walking to in 3 weeks. About the vows I'd speak to David while looking past him to where Cameron would stand with her guitar, providing the music for my greatest deception. I touched my cross necklace, a habit that once brought comfort but now felt like counting rosary beads of regret. The moonlight caught the diamond on my engagement ring, beautiful, expensive, and completely hollow. Just like the life I was building. Sarah found me in the church garden, staring at the roses I'd planted my first year as pastor. She sat beside me on the stone bench, waiting. "David's been drinking," she finally said. "Last night at the foundry he could barely stand." My hands clenched in my lap. The strain of our arrangement was wearing on all of us. "He kept talking about Cameron," Sarah continued. "About how you look at her during rehearsals." "Sarah, please. Let me finish." She took my hand. "I've known you since seminary, Rose. I've watched you build this congregation, pour your heart into these people. But I've never seen you truly happy until her," I whispered. "The board called an emergency meeting for tomorrow." Sarah's voice was gentle. "They want to move the wedding up. James is worried about David's stability." The roses blurred as tears filled my eyes. Everything was unraveling faster than we could weave new lies to hold it together. That afternoon, I found Cameron in her studio, working on arrangements for the wedding ceremony. The irony wasn't lost on either of us. "David came by this morning," she said, without looking up from her guitar. "He was still drunk." My heart stopped. "What did he say?" "That he can't do this anymore." She finally met my eyes. "That watching us pretend is killing him. The board wants to move up the wedding," I blurted out. Cameron's fingers stilled on the strings. The silence between us filled with all our broken promises. "I got the contract," she said finally. "From the record label. They're offering more than just a tour. They want us to relocate to Nashville." "Nashville?" The word felt like a physical blow. "A 3-year deal." She set down her guitar. "David's going to tell them yes." "But the wedding?" "Wake up, Rose," she stood suddenly. "This isn't working. David's drinking, I'm writing songs I can't publish because they're all about you, and you're dying inside trying to please everyone." I reached for her, but she stepped back. "Cam, please." "No." Her voice cracked. "I can't watch you marry him, even pretend. I thought I could, but—" A knock at the studio door made us both jump. David stumbled in, looking worse than I'd ever seen him. "Sorry to interrupt the lovers' quarrel," he slurred. "But we've got a problem." Cameron moved to support him as he swayed. "You need to go home, David." James called me. He looked at me with bloodshot eyes, wanted to know why I wasn't at the marriage counseling session today. I'd completely forgotten. Another crack in our carefully constructed facade. "I almost told him everything," David continued. "About you two, about this whole damn lie." "But you didn't," Cameron said sharply. "Not yet." He pulled away from her support. "But I can't keep doing this. The label wants an answer by tomorrow." I watched them, these two people whose lives I'd complicated with my cowardice. David, trying to help but breaking under the pressure. Cameron, fierce and beautiful, offering me a way out I was too scared to take. "The board meeting's tomorrow morning," I said quietly. "They want to move the wedding to next week." Cameron's face went pale. David laughed bitterly. "Perfect timing," he said. "I'll be in Nashville by then anyway." "David," Cameron started. "No, it's fine." He headed for the door. "You two figure it out. I'm done pretending." After he left, Cameron and I stood in heavy silence. Outside, a church bell rang, ironically, the same one that would have chimed at my wedding. "Come to Nashville with me," she whispered. For a moment, I let myself imagine it, trading my pulpit for her poetry, my collar for her songs. But then I thought of my congregation, of the faces that looked to me for guidance every Sunday. "I can't," I said, the words tasting like ash. Cameron nodded slowly. "Then I guess we both have decisions to make." I left her studio that night knowing something had broken beyond repair. In my car, I found a CD demos of the songs she'd written about us. The first track was titled Pretending. I didn't play it. Some truths are too painful to hear set to music. The morning of the board meeting dawned cold and gray. I sat in my car outside the church, watching early light paint the stained glass windows in muted colors. My phone showed 3 missed calls from David, 5 from Cameron, and 1 text from Sarah. "Whatever you decide, I'm here." James was waiting in the conference room, along with the entire board. Their faces carried the grave concern of people about to perform an intervention. "Pastor Bennett," James began, "we need to discuss David's behavior." I gripped my cross necklace, a habit that now felt more like clutching at straws. Before I could respond, the door burst open. David stumbled in, looking disheveled but surprisingly sober. "Sorry to interrupt," he said, not sounding sorry at all, "but I think it's time for some truth." My heart stopped. "David, please." "No more lies, Rose." He turned to the board. "I can't marry her." The room erupted in murmurs. James stood, his face flushing. "What is the meaning of this?" "The meaning?" David laughed bitterly. "The meaning is I've been helping her hide who she really loves." Time seemed to freeze. I could feel my carefully constructed world crumbling around me. "David," I whispered. "Don't." But he wasn't finished. "You want to know why I've been drinking? Try watching someone you respect destroy themselves, trying to be what everyone else wants." Elder Mary gasped. "Pastor Bennett, what is he talking about?" I stood slowly, my legs shaking. In that moment, I heard Cameron's voice in my head, singing about truth and freedom. "I'm in love," I said quietly. "But not with David." The silence was deafening. James's face had gone from red to white. "Her name is Cameron Brooks." The words hung in the air like a hymn in an empty church. Some board members looked shocked, others sadly unsurprised. "This is unacceptable," James sputtered. "The congregation, the Davidson Fund." "The truth," I interrupted, my voice growing stronger, "is that I've spent my life preaching about God's love while denying my own." Sarah slipped into the room, moving to stand beside me. Her presence gave me strength. "I won't marry David," I continued. "I won't continue this deception. If that means I can't be your pastor anymore." "It does," James cut in sharply. "This is a breach of everything we stand for." "Everything you stand for," Sarah corrected. "Not everything God stands for." The door opened again, and Cameron walked in. My heart leaped at the sight of her, even as panic gripped me. "Sorry I'm late," she said, moving to my other side. "But I couldn't let you do this alone." James looked between us, his expression hardening. "This is a private church matter." "No," I said firmly, "this is my life, and I'm done hiding it." David cleared his throat. "The record label offered us a deal in Nashville, all of us." He looked at me meaningfully, including guest speakers for their faith and music program. I hadn't known about that part. Cameron's hand found mine, squeezing gently. "This is your choice, Rose," she whispered. "But whatever you decide, I'm not leaving without you this time." The boardroom erupted in arguments. James demanded my immediate resignation. Elder Mary quoted scripture about abomination. But through it all, I felt strangely peaceful. "I love this church," I said, silencing the room. "I love this congregation, but I can't lead them while living a lie." I unpinned my collar and placed it on the table. The small click it made seemed to echo through the room. "I choose truth," I said simply. "I choose her." Cameron's grip on my hand tightened. David smiled sadly. Sarah wiped away tears. As we walked out of the church together, the morning sun finally broke through the clouds. The stained glass windows cast rainbow shadows across our path, and for the first time in years I felt truly blessed. In my pocket, my phone buzzed with messages from concerned congregation members. Those bridges would need to be crossed. But for now, walking hand in hand with Cameron toward whatever came next, I finally understood what real faith felt like. It felt like freedom. News travels fast in small southern towns. By Sunday morning, half of Chattanooga seemed to know about the pastor who chose love over tradition. The other half would know by sunset. I sat in my car across from the church, watching my former congregation file in for services. Some glanced my way, quickly averting their eyes. Others waved hesitantly. A few stopped to take photos with their phones, no doubt for the local gossip mill. "You don't have to watch this," Cameron said from the passenger seat. "Yes, I do." I squeezed her hand. "They're still my people." James had arranged for a visiting pastor to lead services. Through the open windows, I could hear the familiar hymns, songs I'd led countless times. The music carried across the parking lot, bittersweet and beautiful. My phone hadn't stopped buzzing since the board meeting. Most messages were what you'd expect. Disappointment, judgment, quotes about sin and salvation. But there were others, surprising ones. "Thank you for showing my daughter it's okay to be herself," one mother wrote. "Your sermons about love finally make sense," said another. The congregation had split, quite literally. As we watched, a group of familiar faces gathered in the church garden instead of going inside. Sarah was among them, along with some of my most devoted parishioners. They're choosing sides, I murmured. They're choosing truth, Cameron corrected. Just like you did. A knock on my window made us jump. It was Mrs. Henderson, my elderly neighbor who'd attended every service for 40 years. Pastor Bennett, she said when I rolled down the window. Or just Rose now, I suppose. Mrs. Henderson, save it, dear. She smiled warmly. I may be old, but I'm not blind. I saw how you looked at this young lady during her performances. Reminded me of how I used to look at my Henry. Tears pricked my eyes. The church will survive. She patted my hand. Some of us are meeting at the community center next Sunday. Sarah's leading a discussion about inclusive faith. We'd love to have you both there. As she walked away, I noticed others from the garden group nodding in our direction. Not everyone had turned their backs. That evening, Cameron had a show at the Foundry, her last before we left for Nashville. The venue was packed, but not with the usual crowd. Mixed among the regular music fans were faces from my congregation, including several board members. This song, Cameron announced, looking directly at me, is for anyone who's ever had to choose between what's expected and what's real. The melody was familiar, the one she'd been working on during our late-night sessions. But the lyrics were new, raw, and honest. She sang about stained glass prisons and finding salvation in surrender. In the middle of the song, Elder Mary stood up and walked out. But behind her, a dozen others stayed, some wiping tears, some holding hands, all listening. After the show, David joined us at the bar. He was sober, clear-eyed, looking more at peace than I'd seen him in months. The label loves the controversy, he said, grinning. They're talking about a documentary, Faith, Love, and Rock and Roll, or something equally cheesy. No way. I laughed. But Cameron looked thoughtful. Maybe that's not a bad idea, she said. Share our story, help others feel less alone. As if on cue, a young woman approached our table. She couldn't have been more than 20, and her hands shook as she spoke. I heard what happened at the church, she said. I've been afraid to tell my parents, about me. But seeing you stand up like Tat. I hugged her without hesitation. Over her shoulder, I saw Cameron smile softly. Later that night, we sat on the hood of my car at Lookout Mountain, where we'd first met. The city lights below twinkled like earthbound stars. Having regrets? Cameron asked, playing with my fingers. About us? Never. I looked at where my collar used to be. About how it happened, maybe. I hurt people I care about. Sometimes healing has to start with breaking, she said. Like your sermons always said. I laughed. You actually listened to those? Every word. She kissed my temple. My favorite pastor. Below us, the church bells rang out, marking midnight. Tomorrow would bring more challenges, moving plans, career changes, bridges to rebuild or burn. But tonight, under the same stars that had witnessed our beginning, we were exactly where we needed to be. Sing it again, I whispered. The new song. And there, with Chattanooga spread out before us like a glittering congregation, Cameron sang about finding heaven in the truth of love. This time, I joined in the chorus. Nashville welcomed us with open arms and Southern skepticism. Our first month was a whirlwind of record label meetings, apartment hunting, and carefully worded press releases. The story of the pastor and the rock singer had caught more attention than any of us expected. I found my calling at a small community center just outside the city. What started as informal discussions about faith and acceptance grew into something more structured. Every Sunday, our gathering included former church members, questioning souls, and curious locals. It's not exactly a church, I explained to Sarah during her first visit. More like a spiritual refuge. It's exactly what some people need, she said, watching the diverse crowd filter in. A place between tradition and transformation. Cameron's band was thriving. Their new album, heavily influenced by our story, resonated with audiences far beyond their usual rock fans. The first single, Stained Glass Heart, hit the Christian rock charts, causing quite a stir. The irony isn't lost on me, Cameron laughed one evening, showing me the rankings. A love song about two women climbing the religious music charts. Our little community center became a sanctuary for others like us. Every week brought new faces, new stories. A Methodist minister questioning his path. A choir director who'd hidden her truth for decades. Teenagers kicked out of their homes for being themselves. "You're doing good work here," David said during one of his visits. He'd stayed in Chattanooga but remained our strongest ally. Different kind of ministry, but maybe more important. One Sunday morning, I was preparing for our weekly gathering when a familiar face appeared at the door. Elder Mary stood awkwardly in the entrance, clutching her worn Bible. "I hope I'm not interrupting," she said softly. My heart raced. Never. She looked around the space, at the mix of traditional religious symbols and pride flags, at the guitar propped in the corner, at the diverse group setting up chairs. "James doesn't know I'm here," she continued. "But my granddaughter, she told us last week, about herself, and I remembered how you used to talk about God's love being bigger than our understanding." I hugged her, feeling years of tension dissolve. "Stay for the gathering?" She did. And when Cameron led the music, a blend of hymns and original songs, Elder Mary sang along, tears streaming down her face. The documentary crew captured it all. They'd been following our journey for weeks, interviewing everyone from angry protesters to supportive fans. But their favorite footage came from the quiet moments. Cameron teaching guitar to a group of LGBTQ youth, me counseling families working through acceptance, our community growing stronger each week. "You've created something beautiful here," the director said, watching us set up for another Sunday gathering. "It's not just about religion or music anymore. It's about authentic living." One evening, after a particularly moving session where a young pastor shared his coming-out story, Cameron pulled me aside. "Remember what you said about missing proper church sometimes?" I nodded, wondering where this was going. "Well," she grinned, "I bought a building, that old theater on 5th Street, perfect for larger gatherings, great acoustics for music." "Cameron Brooks," I laughed. "Are you suggesting we start our own church?" "I'm suggesting we expand what we've already started, a place where faith and love don't have to choose sides, where music and ministry work together, where people can be their whole selves." Looking around at our growing community, at the lives being changed, the hearts being healed, I felt a familiar calling, different from my old pastoral role, but no less sacred. "On one condition," I said, pulling her close. "You have to promise to keep writing songs about us." "Always," she whispered, sealing the promise with a kiss. That night, we sat on our apartment balcony, watching the Nashville sunset. Cameron worked on a new song while I drafted plans for our expanded community center. Below us, the city hummed with possibility. "Think we made the right choice?" she asked, setting aside her guitar. I thought about my old church, about the path I'd expected my life to take. Then I looked at the woman beside me, at the life we'd built, at the people we'd helped. "I think we made the only choice we could," I replied. "The true one." She smiled, picking up her guitar again. As she played the opening notes of Stained Glass Heart, I closed my eyes and thanked whatever divine force had led me to that meteor shower so many months ago. Some would call it fate. Others might say providence. I simply called it grace. 1 year later, I stood on Lookout Mountain, watching another meteor shower paint silver trails across the sky. The spot hadn't changed, but everything else had. "Ready?" Cameron squeezed my hand, her green eyes bright with anticipation. Below us, car headlights wound up the mountain road, our friends and chosen family making their way to witness this moment. Sarah had organized everything, insisting that where our story began was where it should begin again. "I still can't believe James agreed to come," I whispered, adjusting my simple white dress. "People can surprise you," Cameron smiled, looking stunning in her tailored suit. "Elder Mary can be very persuasive." The clearing had been transformed. Fairy lights twinkled in the trees, mixing with the starlight above. Guitar cases doubled as makeshift altars, holding candles and flowers. Our guests gathered in a circle, creating an intimate sanctuary under the open sky. David stood ready with his guitar, looking healthy and happy. He'd been sober for 10 months now, finding his own path to healing. Beside him, Sarah arranged sheet music for the song she and Cameron had written specially for tonight. "Your old congregation's here," Cameron murmured, nodding toward a group of familiar faces. Indeed, mixed among our Nashville community were people from my former church. Some had become regular visitors to our new spiritual center. Others were still finding their way toward acceptance. But they were here. As the ceremony began, a meteor streaked overhead, a cosmic blessing that drew gasps from the crowd. Sarah started playing, and Cameron's voice filled the night air with our story set to music. "Dearly beloved," David began, his voice carrying across the mountaintop, "we gather under these same stars that witnessed their first meeting." The ceremony was unconventional, blending traditional elements with our own truth. Instead of traditional vows, we shared songs. Rather than scripture readings, we had poetry about love transcending boundaries. When it came time for the rings, Elder Mary stepped forward. "These were my grandmother's," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "She taught me that love is love. It just took me a while to understand." James stood at the back, watching silently. When our eyes met, he gave a slight nod. Not full acceptance, perhaps, but acknowledgement. It was enough. "By the power of love that knows no bounds," David proclaimed, "and the state of Tennessee's recently updated laws, I now pronounce you married." Cheers erupted as we kissed. Above us, the meteor shower reached its peak, as if the heavens themselves were celebrating. The reception was a beautiful chaos of music and joy. Cameron's band played while church hymns got rock and roll makeovers. Former parishioners danced with Nashville musicians. Sarah led everyone in a song she'd written about our journey. Later, as the party wound down, Cameron and I slipped away to our original meeting spot. The city lights sparkled below, but the stars above shone brighter. "Make a wish," she whispered, as another meteor blazed across the sky. "Already have everything I wished for," I replied, touching the ring on my finger. She pulled out her guitar, the same one she'd had that first night. "I wrote something new. Want to hear it?" The melody was hauntingly familiar, yet different. As she sang, I recognized pieces of every song she'd written about us, woven into something new. A musical tapestry of our journey. "That's going on the new album?" I asked when she finished. "Actually," she smiled mysteriously, "I was thinking it might work better as a hymn, for our new community center's first official service next month." I laughed, remembering how this all began, a pastor bound by tradition, a musician breaking all the rules. Now here we were, creating our own harmony. "What shall we call it?" I asked. Cameron looked up at the stars, then back at me. "How about Meteor Prayer?" "Perfect. Just like that first night, just like every night since, just like the lifetime of nights ahead." Above us, the last meteor of the shower traced a brilliant path across the sky, but we didn't need to wish on falling stars anymore. We had already found our miracle, in each other, in our community, in the courage to choose love over fear, and that was the greatest blessing of all.